In the cold depths of Munich's Stadelheim prison on February 22, 1943, a 21-year-old woman walked calmly toward her death, displaying courage that would haunt her executioner for the rest of his life. Sophie Scholl's final moments were witnessed by Johann Reichardt, Nazi Germany's most prolific executioner, who later confessed that in all his years of carrying out death sentences, he had never encountered someone who faced death with such unwavering bravery. What makes Sophie's story even more chilling is not just how she died, but the calculated precision with which the Nazi regime systematically destroyed a young woman whose only crime was believing in human dignity and speaking truth to power. The guillotine that claimed Sophie's life was not the towering contraption of revolutionary France, but a more compact, efficient killing machine known as the Fallbeil. A German variant designed specifically for quick, quiet executions within prison walls. This instrument of death had been refined over decades to serve the Nazi state's appetite for eliminating dissent with clinical efficiency. The machine stood approximately 8 feet tall, its angled blade weighing nearly 90 pounds, engineered to sever a human head in a fraction of a second. Unlike public executions of earlier eras, these deaths occurred in sterile prison courtyards, witnessed only by a handful of officials and the condemned person's executioner. Sophie Scholl's path to this horrific end began not with violence or terrorism, but with words printed on paper, leaflets that dared to challenge the Nazi regime's stranglehold on German society. She was a member of the White Rose, a resistance group composed primarily of university students, who believed that ordinary Germans needed to wake up to the moral catastrophe unfolding around them. These young people, armed with nothing more than typewriters, mimeograph machines, and extraordinary courage, attempted to pierce through the fog of propaganda that had enveloped their nation. Their weapons were philosophical arguments, moral appeals, and factual accounts of Nazi atrocities that most Germans either didn't know about or chose to ignore. The White Rose resistance movement emerged from the University of Munich in 1942, founded by siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl along with their friends Alexander Schmorell, Willy Graf, and Christoph Probst, under the intellectual guidance of philosophy professor Kurt Huber. These students had witnessed the gradual transformation of their country from a troubled democracy into a totalitarian nightmare, and they refused to remain silent. Their leaflets distributed secretly across Munich and other German cities contained devastating critiques of Nazi ideology and detailed accounts of the Holocaust that the regime desperately wanted to keep hidden from the German people. The group's name, White Rose, symbolized purity and resistance against the darkness that had consumed Germany. Sophie Scholl was born into a Germany that was rapidly changing. Her formative years were shaped by the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Initially, like many young Germans, she was swept up in the excitement of the Hitler Youth movement, attracted by its emphasis on outdoor activities and national pride. However, as she matured and began to understand the true nature of Nazi ideology, her enthusiasm transformed into horror and then into active resistance. Her father, Robert Scholl, had been imprisoned for making anti-Nazi remarks, and this personal experience with Nazi oppression strengthened her resolve to fight against the regime. Sophie's transformation from a typical German teenager to a resistance fighter represents the moral awakening that the Nazi regime feared most among its own people. The Scholl family's journey from Nazi supporters to resistance fighters mirrors the complex psychological landscape of wartime Germany. Sophie's older brother, Hans, had initially been an enthusiastic Hitler Youth leader, but his experiences on the Eastern Front as a medical student serving in the German army exposed him to the brutal realities of Nazi policies. He witnessed the systematic murder of Jewish civilians and the inhuman treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, experiences that shattered his remaining illusions about the Nazi cause. When Hans returned to Munich to continue his medical studies, he brought with him a burning need to act against the regime that had turned his generation into accomplices to genocide. This transformation from complicity to resistance was precisely what kept Nazi officials awake at night, fearing that their own people might turn against them. The White Rose leaflets were masterpieces of moral reasoning and political analysis, written with the sophistication that reflected the group's university education and their deep engagement with philosophy, theology, and literature. These documents didn't simply condemn Nazi policies, they provided detailed philosophical arguments for why ordinary Germans had a moral obligation to resist their government. The leaflets drew from Christian theology, classical philosophy, and contemporary political theory to build a case that collaboration with the Nazi regime was morally indefensible. They contain specific information about Nazi atrocities, including detailed accounts of the murder of Polish Jews and the brutal treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. Information that the regime had tried desperately to keep from the German public. The first White Rose leaflet, distributed in June 1942, began with a stark declaration: "Nothing is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition by an irresponsible clique that has yielded to base instinct." The document went on to provide specific details about Nazi crimes, including the murder of 300,000 Jews in Poland, information that most Germans claimed they didn't know. The leaflet's authors understood that many Germans supported Hitler, not because they were inherently evil, but because they had been systematically deceived about the true nature of his policies. By providing factual information about Nazi atrocities alongside philosophical arguments about moral responsibility, the White Rose hoped to break through the wall of propaganda and denial that protected the regime from popular opposition. The group's activities required extraordinary courage and careful planning. Sophie and her companions would travel to different German cities carrying suitcases full of leaflets that they would distribute in telephone booths, mail to randomly selected addresses, and leave in public places where ordinary Germans might find them. They operated under constant threat of discovery, knowing that possession of even a single leaflet could result in arrest, torture, and execution. The Gestapo, Nazi Germany's secret police, was actively hunting for the leaflet distributors, using sophisticated investigative techniques to track down anyone connected to anti-Nazi activities. Despite these dangers, the White Rose continued their work, driven by a moral conviction that silence in the face of evil was itself a form of complicity. The Nazi regime's response to the White Rose leaflets reveals the extent to which the government feared the power of moral argument and factual information. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, personally ordered an intensive investigation to track down the leaflet distributors. The regime understood that the White Rose represented something far more dangerous than armed resistance. They represented the possibility that ordinary Germans might develop a moral conscience and turn against their government. The leaflets were particularly threatening because they spoke directly to educated Germans in language that resonated with traditional German values of scholarship, religious faith, and moral responsibility. The beginning of the end for Sophie Scholl came on February 18, 1943, when she and her brother Hans made a fatal decision that would cost them their lives. They had just distributed their sixth leaflet throughout the University of Munich, scattering copies in hallways and classrooms where students would find them. However, they had a few leaflets left over, and in a moment of spontaneous courage, or perhaps recklessness, Sophie decided to throw the remaining leaflets from the top floor of the university's main building into the central courtyard below. This dramatic gesture was witnessed by Jacob Schmid, a university janitor and Nazi Party member, who immediately reported them to the authorities. The arrest of Sophie and Hans Scholl was swift and brutal. Within minutes of Schmid's report, the Gestapo had surrounded the university and arrested the siblings. They were taken to the Völkischer Beobachter Palace, which served as Gestapo headquarters in Munich, where they faced immediate interrogation by experienced Nazi investigators. The Gestapo's techniques were designed to break down resistance through a combination of psychological pressure, physical deprivation, and the constant threat of violence. Sophie and Hans were separated and interrogated individually, with their captors attempting to turn them against each other and extract information about their fellow resistance members. Sophie's interrogation lasted for 4 days, during which she demonstrated remarkable composure and intelligence in her responses to Nazi investigators. Initially, she and Hans attempted to maintain their innocence, claiming they had nothing to do with the leaflets, and had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, when confronted with physical evidence, including a handwritten draft of a leaflet found in Hans's possession, Sophie made a strategic decision to accept responsibility for her actions while attempting to protect her fellow resistance members. Her responses during interrogation reveal a young woman who remained committed to her principles even under extreme duress. The Nazi justice system that condemned Sophie Scholl was designed to provide a veneer of legality to what was essentially state-sponsored murder. The People's Court, presided over by the notorious Judge Roland Freisler, was specifically created to handle cases of treason and subversion against the Nazi state. Freisler, known for his theatrical displays of rage and his predetermined verdicts, conducted show trials that served more as propaganda exercises than genuine legal proceedings. The court's proceedings were carefully choreographed to humiliate the defendants while demonstrating the regime's power to crush any opposition. Sophie's trial began on February 22, 1943, just 4 days after her arrest. The speed of the proceedings was intentional, designed to prevent any possibility of outside intervention or public sympathy for the defendants. Sophie, Hans, and their friend Christoph Probst were brought before the court in shackles, facing judges who had already decided their fate. The trial lasted only a few hours, with Freisler delivering a performance of manufactured outrage and moral condemnation that was recorded for propaganda purposes. The defendants were not permitted to mount a meaningful defense, and their lawyers were effectively prohibited from challenging the charges or the evidence. During the trial, Sophie Scholl's responses to Judge Freisler revealed the strength of her convictions and her refusal to be intimidated by the Nazi court. When Freisler accused her of betraying her country, Sophie responded that she had acted according to her conscience, and that she would do the same thing again if given the chance. Her calm demeanor and articulate responses clearly frustrated Freisler, who expected defendants to grovel for mercy or break down under pressure. Sophie's behavior in court demonstrated that the Nazi regime had failed to break her spirit, even as it prepared to destroy her body. The death sentence pronounced against Sophie Scholl was not unexpected, but its swift implementation reveals the regime's desperation to silence the White Rose before their message could spread further. Freisler sentenced Sophie, Hans, and Christoph to death by guillotine, with the execution scheduled for the same day as the trial. This unprecedented speed was designed to prevent any possibility of appeal, clemency, or rescue. The regime understood that the longer the White Rose members remained alive, the greater the risk that their message would inspire others to resist. Sophie's final hours were spent in a cell in Stadelheim prison, where she was allowed a brief visit from her parents and her sister Inga. These final conversations, later recounted by her family members, reveal a young woman who had found peace with her decision to resist the Nazi regime, even though it would cost her life. Sophie told her family that she had no regrets about her actions, and that she believed her death would not be in vain if it inspired others to recognize the moral catastrophe that had befallen Germany. Her composure during these final hours left a profound impression on her family members and the prison chaplain who attended her. The execution chamber at Stadelheim prison was designed for efficiency rather than spectacle, reflecting the Nazi regime's preference for carrying out death sentences quickly and quietly. The room contained the Fabel, a German variant of the guillotine, that had been refined over decades to serve the state's needs for rapid executions. Unlike the public executions of earlier eras, these deaths occurred in sterile prison courtyards witnessed only by a handful of officials and the condemned person's executioner. The machine itself stood approximately 8 feet tall, its angled blade weighing nearly 90 pounds, engineered to sever a human head in a fraction of a second. Johann Reichardt, the executioner who carried out Sophie's death sentence, was a professional killer who had performed hundreds of executions for the Nazi regime. Reichardt had been trained in the precise techniques required to operate the Fabel efficiently, and he took pride in his ability to carry out death sentences quickly and cleanly. However, his encounter with Sophie Scholl would haunt him for the rest of his life. In later interviews, Reichardt described Sophie as the most courageous person he had ever executed, noting that she walked to her death with a calm dignity that was completely unprecedented in his experience. The actual execution process was designed to minimize the condemned person's suffering while maximizing the efficiency of the killing. Sophie was led from her cell to the execution chamber, where she was positioned on the Fabel with her neck placed in the lunette, a circular opening that would hold her head in position for the blade. The entire process, from entering the chamber to the moment of death, was designed to take less than a minute. However, witnesses reported that Sophie maintained her composure throughout the procedure, refusing to show fear or beg for mercy even in her final moments. Sophie's last words, as recorded by prison officials, were a testament to her unwavering commitment to her principles. She declared that her death would not be in vain, and that others would continue the fight against the Nazi regime. Her final statement was both a personal declaration of faith and a political act of defiance, demonstrating that the regime, had failed to break her spirit even as it prepared to destroy her body. The impact of her words on the witnesses was profound, with several prison officials later reporting that they had never seen anyone face death with such courage and dignity. The blade of the fall fell at 5 p.m. on February 22, 1943, ending the life of Sophie Scholl just hours after her trial and sentencing. The execution was carried out with the clinical efficiency that characterized the Nazi regime's approach to eliminating opposition. However, the regime's success in silencing Sophie's voice was short-lived as news of her execution and the circumstances surrounding it began to spread throughout Germany and beyond. The Nazi authorities had intended to make an example of Sophie and her companions, but instead, they had created martyrs whose courage would inspire resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. The immediate aftermath of Sophie's execution revealed the regime's awareness that they had made a serious miscalculation. Rather than deterring further resistance, the executions of the White Rose members inspired additional acts of defiance and created a powerful symbol of moral courage under Nazi tyranny. Underground resistance networks throughout Germany began distributing copies of the White Rose leaflets, ensuring that Sophie's message would reach far more people in death than it had during her lifetime. The Allied forces, learning of the executions through intelligence networks, began using the story of the White Rose in their propaganda broadcasts to Germany, further amplifying the impact of Sophie's sacrifice. The Nazi regime's attempt to erase the memory of Sophie Scholl and the White Rose proved futile in the long term. Despite their efforts to suppress information about the executions and to destroy all copies of the leaflets, the story of the White Rose began to spread through underground networks and eventually reached the outside world. Allied intelligence services recognized the propaganda value of the story and began broadcasting details of the executions to Germany, presenting Sophie and her companions as examples of the moral awakening that the Nazi regime feared most among its own people. Johann Reichardt, the executioner who carried out Sophie's death sentence, was profoundly affected by the experience and later became an important witness to her courage. In interviews conducted after the war, Reichardt described Sophie as unlike any other person he had executed, noting that she maintained her dignity and composure even in the face of death. His testimony became an important part of the historical record, providing first-hand evidence of Sophie's extraordinary courage and the impact her behavior had on those who witnessed her final moments. The broader impact of Sophie Scholl's execution extended far beyond Germany's borders, inspiring resistance movements throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. The story of the White Rose became a powerful symbol of moral courage under totalitarian oppression, demonstrating that individuals could maintain their humanity and principles even in the face of overwhelming state power. Resistance groups in France, Norway, the Netherlands, and other occupied countries adopted the White Rose as a symbol of their own struggles against Nazi tyranny, ensuring that Sophie's message would reach audiences that the original leaflets never could have reached. The preservation of Sophie Scholl's memory became an act of resistance in itself. As survivors of the Nazi regime worked to ensure that her story would not be forgotten, family members, friends, and fellow resistance fighters collected documents, testimonies, and photographs that would later serve as the foundation for books, films, and memorials dedicated to preserving the memory of the White Rose. These efforts were often conducted at great personal risk, as the Nazi regime continued to hunt down anyone connected to resistance activities even after the executions had taken place. The psychological impact of Sophie's execution on German society was profound and lasting. Her story challenged the narrative that ordinary Germans had no choice but to support the Nazi regime, demonstrating that moral resistance was possible even under the most oppressive conditions. The courage she displayed in her final hours became a standard against which other acts of resistance were measured, inspiring countless individuals to find their own ways of opposing tyranny and injustice. Her example proved that the human spirit could not be completely crushed by even the most brutal totalitarian regime. The legacy of Sophie Scholl's execution continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about moral responsibility and resistance to oppression. Her story has been studied by scholars, activists, and ordinary citizens seeking to understand how individuals can maintain their principles under extreme pressure. The questions raised by her sacrifice about the obligations of citizens under unjust governments, the power of moral conviction, and the price of resistance remain relevant in societies throughout the world. Her execution, intended to silence dissent, instead created a powerful voice for justice that continues to speak across generations. The documentation of Sophie's final hours, preserved through testimonies and official records, provides a chilling glimpse into the machinery of Nazi oppression and the extraordinary courage required to resist it. The clinical efficiency with which the regime carried out her execution, combined with the speed of the judicial proceedings, demonstrates the systematic nature of Nazi persecution and the lengths to which the regime would go to eliminate any challenge to its authority. Yet the very thoroughness of this documentation also ensures that Sophie's courage and the circumstances of her death will never be forgotten. The transformation of Sophie Scholl from a living person into a symbol of resistance represents one of the most powerful ironies of the Nazi regime's approach to opposition. By executing her with such speed and brutality, the regime intended to demonstrate the futility of resistance and the price of challenging state authority. Instead, they created a martyr whose courage would inspire resistance movements for generations to come. The guillotine that was meant to silence her voice instead amplified it, ensuring that her message would reach audiences far beyond what she could have imagined during her lifetime. In the end, Sophie Scholl's execution represents both the ultimate horror of Nazi tyranny and the ultimate triumph of the human spirit over oppression. Her willingness to face death rather than compromise her principles demonstrates that even the most powerful totalitarian regime cannot completely crush the human capacity for moral resistance. The courage she displayed in her final hours, witnessed by her executioner and preserved in historical records, serves as an eternal reminder that individuals have the power to choose dignity over survival, truth over comfort, and resistance over complicity, even in the face of the most horrific consequences. The guillotine fell on February 22, 1943. But Sophie Scholl's voice continues to speak, reminding us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that the courage of a single individual can illuminate the darkness of an entire era. Her execution was meant to be the end of her story. But it was actually the beginning of her immortality as a symbol of moral courage under the most extreme oppression. In dying for her principles, Sophie Scholl achieved something that her executioners could never understand. She proved that the human spirit, once awakened to truth and justice, cannot be destroyed by any earthly power.